The sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the peace of downtown Chicago that afternoon, cutting through the ordinary hum of city life like a bolt of lightning. What had started as just another regular day, a few clouds hanging over Lake Michigan, cars weaving in the steady rhythm of traffic, the distant sounds of street vendors and kids playing, was suddenly frozen in time. Malcolm Harris, a black man known in the neighborhood for his steady presence and easy smile, felt the world slipping away from him even as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. His body, warm and strong only seconds before, now pulsed with a raw surge of pain, blood spreading quickly beneath him on the hot concrete. A moment earlier, he had reached for his phone, which had started ringing with a familiar melody. Next, there was the sound, so quick, so final, and everything changed. The officer who had pulled the trigger, Officer Brian O'Reilly, stood with his weapon still raised, eyes hard and jaw clenched. His face was blank, but somehow full of a cold certainty, as if he had already justified the shot to himself 1,000 times. Malcolm's eyes locked on Brian's, wide with confusion and a silent, desperate question that could never really be answered. In that charged silence, it was as if the whole city held its breath. Malcolm dropped the phone, and it skittered across the sidewalk, coming to rest by the curb, still buzzing with missed calls. That device, which had carried so many words of love, plans, and hopeful messages, now lay there as the only witness to an unraveling life. Crowds began to gather, drawn to the scene by the sudden noise and rising tension. There were gasps and hurried whispers, yet Malcolm's focus narrowed to one thing, trying to keep his eyes open, to hold on to the world that was slipping from his grasp. He caught one last glimpse of the city he loved, the brick storefronts, the bold graffiti, a patch of blue sky between tall buildings, before his strength started to fade. Time seemed to twist in those final moments, leaving Malcolm straddling the space between outrage and sorrow. What was supposed to be just another Tuesday was now carved into the memory of a community forever changed, grief and disbelief settling over everyone who saw a future transformed into mourning in the space of a heartbeat. Officer Brian O'Reilly stood completely still, gun raised, his hand trembling ever so slightly as a thin wisp of smoke rose from the barrel. For a split second, he had felt an almost mechanical sense of command, of carrying out his duty as he saw it. But the cold assurance faded almost immediately, replaced by a wave of horror that twisted his features. His authority no longer felt like confidence. Instead, it became a heavy, suffocating burden. The magnitude of what he had done began to press down on him with every breath, as if the world had closed in to watch him confront the irreversibility of his action. Months and months at the Chicago Police Department, the long hours, the constant tension, his belief in discipline and chain of command, all of it felt meaningless right now. The street was packed with onlookers, their eyes locked onto Brian, some with shock, others with growing anger. His mind raced. He tried to replay what just happened in his head, but the details felt warped. He remembered Malcolm reaching toward his phone, the flicker of uncertainty, and then, before reason could intervene, his own finger had squeezed the trigger. Only now, as the adrenaline faded and his legs threatened to give way, did the consequences finally hit him. There would be no ordinary paperwork to explain this. He stared at Malcolm, at the spreading pool of blood, and felt cold dread settle deep in his bones. Just an hour before, Malcolm Harris had been driving his silver sedan through South Side, windows up and air conditioning shielding him from the sticky August air. He had been on his way home from a long shift at Mercy Hospital, still wearing his ID badge, hoping for nothing more than an evening with his family. He hummed along to the radio, thinking about dinner and a movie with his kids, relieved to finally have a little time after several exhausting weeks at work. For him, the afternoon had been nothing unusual. A man returning from doing good, his mind far from anything resembling danger. He never imagined that, because of who he was and where he was driving, he would become the center of tragedy that afternoon. In just a few minutes, an ordinary drive transformed into a collision with something much larger. The events that unfolded would crack open conversations that reached far beyond the city, igniting questions about identity, fear, and the kind of justice that every American quietly hopes is real. All the while, Brian stood at the epicenter, caught between his uniform and the irreversible moment already echoing across the neighborhood. As Malcolm drove through the wide, tree-lined streets of Hyde Park, the traffic had thinned out, letting his mind drift towards small comforts. He was on his way to see his mother, Helen, something he tried to do every week, no matter how busy things got at the hospital. He was bringing with him a chocolate cake from Celia's bakery, a family favorite for as long as he could remember, a simple gesture, but one that always filled the house with laughter and stories. Just thinking about it, he smiled, picturing his mom's surprised face and the inevitable jokes she would make about his lack of cooking skills. Malcolm's years as a nurse had taught him about the weight people carry, but right now he let himself relax. The neighborhoods he passed were calm, old stone mansions on neatly groomed lawns, flower beds lining the walkways, the kind of peaceful setting that gives a person confidence in ordinary joys. He rolled down his window, letting in the scent of cut grass, and turned up the volume on his favorite jazz station. It was moments like these that reminded Malcolm why he loved the city, despite the headlines and the day-to-day hardships he saw at work. But tucked between those quiet avenues was a different current, one that ran deeper than curb appeal or expensive fences. Officer Brian O'Reilly, who had just pulled off a side street for his usual patrol, caught sight of Malcolm's luxury sedan cruising slowly past the landmark homes. Something about the driver, a well-dressed black man in a new car, looking out of place in Brian's eyes, sparked a flicker of suspicion. Brian adjusted his grip on the steering wheel and slowed, his attention sharpening. It wasn't the first time he had responded to out-of-the-ordinary vehicles in these parts, and the department had always emphasized vigilance in so-called target zones. The calm of Hyde Park, held together by wealth and careful appearances, began to dissolve, replaced by Brian's narrowed focus and the subtle shift in his body language. In his mind, the presence of Malcolm behind the wheel did not fit the unspoken patterns he was trained to notice. He followed at a distance, his cruiser keeping just out of Malcolm's line of sight. The illusion of safety of those pretty lawns and breakfast spots crumbled suddenly under the pressure of suspicion. What was for Malcolm just a hopeful visit to his mother, and a simple cake quickly turned into the beginning of a silent chase that would upend everything he and the neighborhood thought was possible on an ordinary day. Without so much as a reasonable excuse, Officer Brian O'Reilly made a quick decision and flipped on the red and blue lights, their reflection bouncing off the fancy stone houses and shattering the quiet of the block. For a moment, there was confusion. Malcolm had not been speeding or swerving, and there were no busted taillights or any other obvious reasons to be pulled over. He glanced in the rearview mirror, feeling a familiar mix of worry and resignation settle in his chest. This was not the first time he had been stopped for nothing more than driving while black in an upscale neighborhood. Brian pulled his cruiser. In close behind Malcolm's car, the siren silent but the message clear. He walked up to the window, his stance rigid. The way he barked, "License and registration," left no room for any doubt. He was not here for conversation. There was no explanation, no simple, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Just his hand resting too close to his hip, brows furrowed deeper every second. Malcolm, hoping to keep things calm, rolled down the window and handed over his documents without argument. His movements were slow and open, just as they taught at all those community meetings. Keep your hands in plain sight. Answer politely. Never talk back. "Everything okay, officer?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady. But Brian did not answer his question. He barely looked at Malcolm, just snatched the paperwork and glared. Malcolm sat quietly, holding back the urge to explain himself. He thought about his mother waiting with her front porch light on, her texts about the cake, the dinner plans he had promised to make. The whole stop, if it could even be called that, had nothing to do with a broken law. It was about something else entirely, and they both knew it. Malcolm could feel the disrespect in the air, as thick as the humidity outside. To Brian, this was not about protecting the neighborhood or checking in on a possible crime. He had already decided Malcolm did not belong, and that was all it took to turn a peaceful day upside down. It became painfully obvious that fairness and procedure had left the conversation before it even started. What should have been a routine trip home for Malcolm was now a moment heavy with tension, the kind that makes you realize how quickly things can shift from safe to threatening, and how fragile justice really is when stripped of empathy. The air in the car thickened as Officer Brian O'Reilly's questions shifted from routine to suspicious, his tone dripping with distrust. He leaned in closer, peering through the window as if expecting to spot something incriminating. It was clear Brian had settled on the idea that Malcolm's presence in the neighborhood was, by itself, suspicious enough to justify the stop. Each of his questions circled back to the same point. Why was Malcolm in Hyde Park? Why was he driving that particular car? And who was he here to see? He seemed determined not to believe the simple answers. Malcolm felt the pressure rising, his chest tight with the effort to keep frustration at bay. He answered every question calmly, repeating that he was only there to visit his mother, Helen. He even pointed to the cake on the passenger seat, still in its bakery box, and explained about the weekly tradition. He offered up his driver's license, insurance, and the hospital ID he wore around his neck, hoping the police officer might see reason. Yet the suspicion did not fade. Instead, Officer Brian scrutinized each detail, acting as if Malcolm's careful explanations were somehow an attempt to deceive him. Malcolm could sense that every word he spoke made Brian angrier, as if politeness was a kind of defiance. The smallest movement, his hand reaching for his ID, his attempt to offer the bakery receipt, was treated like some sort of risky act. Brian stiffened, giving sharp warnings to "keep your hands where I can see them," and cutting off Malcolm's attempts at conversation with clipped, impatient replies. The situation teetered on a knife edge. Malcolm felt his patience running thin, a dull ache behind his eyes from having to defend his very existence in a place he knew as well as any other Chicagoan. Inside, he was screaming at the unfairness, but decades of experience taught him to swallow his anger, to keep his voice measured and his hands steady. Still, Malcolm pressed on, feeling he owed his mother the effort it took to stay safe. He assured Brian yet again that he was there for family, that he was not looking for trouble or trying to hide anything. Everything he did was an attempt to show openness. But for Brian, every movement and answer landed like an insult, seeming to confirm the resentment that had started the moment he flipped those red and blue lights. The divide between truth and assumption grew deeper, with Malcolm's discipline the only thing holding back disaster. The back and forth with Officer Brian O'Reilly was grinding Malcolm's patience into dust, even as he summoned every ounce of discipline to keep his face neutral and his voice calm. It did not matter that he answered each question honestly, kept his movements slow, or tried to steer the conversation back to reason. The tension kept mounting, humming in the air between them. Then Brian's tone shifted again, sharper and more forceful, and he barked, "Step out of the vehicle." The command was loud enough for people on nearby porches to glance in their direction. Malcolm knew by now that any sign of resistance could make things spiral fast. His first instinct was to ask why, but years of seeing how these moments could suddenly become dangerous taught him that words would do little good. Brian moved a little closer, one hand resting conspicuously on his holster as he muttered, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." His words were loaded, part warning, part threat, a reminder of the unequal balance of power hanging in the humid Chicago evening. For a split second, Malcolm felt the sharp sting of fear. Every high-profile story he had watched on the news flashed through his mind, each ending with a headline and grieving families. Determined not to let fear or anger dictate his actions, Malcolm took a steady breath, unbuckled his seatbelt, and opened the car door. He stepped onto the street with dignity, his hands visible, fingers open and away from his body. The cake on the seat was forgotten for the moment. He looked Brian in the eye, doing his best to project respect, not challenge, even though indignity burned inside him. But Brian saw Malcolm's calm as something else, an affront. Instead of easing up, Brian used the opportunity to ramp up his own show of power. He circled Malcolm, speaking in short, clipped sentences, raising his voice so bystanders could not miss the tension. Every question was more pointed than the last, "What's really going on here? Are you hiding something in the car?" His words felt like accusations, a performance meant to remind Malcolm and anyone watching who was in charge. Malcolm explained, step by step, moving only when told. Still, everything felt wrong. Cooperation in Brian's eyes did not ease suspicions. It turned into something to twist and mock. No matter how much dignity Malcolm carried himself with, the humiliation kept piling on, making those few minutes feel impossibly long. Standing by the curb in the invading daylight, Malcolm squared his shoulders and looked Officer Brian O'Reilly straight in the eye. He could feel the weight of every neighbor's gaze, the heat from the asphalt, and the knot of both fear and pride tightening in his chest. This was the same man who had led teams through medical crises, who had spoken up for patients and colleagues at Mercy Hospital for more than 20 years. He could not let himself be broken or bullied here, out in the open, not when he had spent his whole life standing up for what was right. So Malcolm found his voice, letting it ring out steady and clear, refusing to look away. "I have the right to be here," he said, each word measured but firm. "I'm visiting my mother, just like I told you. You have nothing to go on, and you know it." There was no hint of apology or retreat. The old lessons about how to keep your head down seemed far away now. In their place was a different lesson altogether, the kind that comes from seeing injustice over and over until eventually silence is no longer an option. Brian's face flickered, something between surprise and anger crossing his features. For a long moment, neither man moved. The neighborhood was silent except for a faint breeze and the chatter of people gathering at a distance. Then, as if something inside him snapped, Brian began to shout, his voice echoing along the street. The words he used were meant to cut deeply, blatantly racist, stripping away any official pretense and making his motives painfully obvious. He threw out slurs and accusations that had nothing to do with traffic or safety, letting his bigotry boil over for all to see. Malcolm's hands curled into fists at his side, but he would not raise them. He would not sink to hate. Instead, his anger sharpened into focus. This was not about keeping order, and it was certainly not about the law. Any hope of a real conversation died then, replaced by the clear knowledge that he had to protect himself, document this moment, as best he could from memory, or with a quick picture on his phone, if Brian let him. Survival, not negotiation, became his priority. He stared at Brian, steady as ever, refusing to let him have the last word and promising himself quietly that the truth of this would not be buried in silence. Malcolm, pulse racing, slid his hand slowly toward his pocket, never breaking eye contact with Brian. In these moments, everything seemed to stretch. Time slowed as Malcolm thought through every movement, knowing how quickly anything could be misunderstood. Deep down, He just wanted some form of protection, to record what was happening, or at least collect evidence in his own defense. The idea of reaching into his pocket for his phone was something he had done 1,000 times, but now it felt like stepping onto a tightrope with no net below. He tried to move carefully, signaling his intentions. "I'm getting my phone. I want to make sure this is all recorded," he said, making each word clear, hoping to avoid setting off more alarm. Still, Malcolm caught the flash of panic and anger in Brian's eyes. For Brian, so caught up in his own fear and bias, this ordinary action became something dangerous, an excuse to act on the tension that had been building since the moment he spotted Malcolm's car. The next few seconds felt both endless and over in a blink. As Malcolm pulled the phone out, Brian's hand shot to his holster, and only a split second later, a shot rang out. The sound echoed down the block, scattering the crowd that had quietly gathered. There was no warning. The force and shock of it knocked Malcolm back, and he crumpled to the ground, clutching at the wound blooming across his shirt. The bakery box tumbled from the seat and hit the sidewalk, landing in a smear of chocolate and icing. Neighbors stared, horrified. Some covered their mouths. Others reached for their own phones, trying to call for help or capture the aftermath, but stunned silence hung among the crowd. Helen's porch light still glowed half a block away, unaware of what had just happened to her son. Brian froze, weapon drawn and chest heaving, surrounded by a scene far different from whatever story he would later try to tell. Malcolm's life, built from years of helping others, fighting for dignity and fairness, ended on the same neighborhood street he had so often called safe. The sidewalk, marked now by blood and grief, held the proof of what prejudice and fear can do in a split second, changing everything forever for a family and a community left wondering how justice could ever be restored. The silence that followed. The gunshot was louder than the noise itself. On any other evening in Hyde Park, people would be unwinding after work or bringing groceries in from their cars. But now, the stillness shattered as window blinds snapped open and porch lights flicked. On all up and down the street, fearful faces peered from behind glass, and people stared, in disbelief at the sight outside. There was a moment where it felt like nobody could move, like the block was holding its breath, waiting for someone to say it had all been a mistake. Then, as if waking from a trance, the first of the neighbors reached for the phone and called 911. Voices, shaky and urgent, tried to explain what they had seen and heard, but even putting the terror into words felt strange. Nobody could look away from the person lying on the pavement, the dark stain spreading, the phone lying useless nearby, or the police officer still standing with his weapon out. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night, signaling that help was on the way. Police cars, an ambulance, and even a fire truck soon rolled up and crowded the street. The blue and white lights painted moving shapes on the row houses, turning front steps into a stage for a tragedy that would not easily be forgotten. Strangers, drawn by the commotion, drifted closer to see what had happened, their voices hushed with a mix of outrage and worry. Officer Brian O'Reilly wasted no time grabbing his radio to get his version of events out first. He spoke fast, voice steady, shaping the story before anyone else could. Officer involved shooting, subject reached for a weapon. He kept his words carefully measured, hoping the chaos, the flood of uniforms now arriving, would keep too many questions from being asked right away. But he could not control the whispers spreading through the crowd. Neighbors knew Malcolm was no threat, knew him as Dr. Malcolm Porter, the gentleman who visited his mother every Sunday and always stopped to say hello. It did not take long for the mood on the street to shift. Shock mixed with anger, and the scene felt bigger than what Brian could contain with words or excuses. The truth, raw and chilling, was already out, winding its way through the neighborhood faster than any officer could cover it up. As paramedics pushed through the circle of police tape, the confusion settled into a cold, focused panic. Another patrol car screeched to a halt nearby, and out stepped Linda Gonzalez, a captain with the Chicago Police Department. She was older, steady under pressure, someone whose name made junior officers straighten up. Linda had seen just about everything in her 30 years on the force, but tonight felt different from the first moment she walked up to the scene. She moved fast, quietly surveying the faces around her and the shape of what had happened. It was her job to manage these first critical moments, but something about Officer Brian O'Reilly's account and the reaction of neighbors made her pause. While the paramedics hovered over Malcolm's still form, an officer collected his wallet and hospital badge. Linda took these items and glanced at the name, Dr. Malcolm Porter. She frowned, something ticking in her mind from the briefings she had attended downtown. Malcolm's identification did not just show he was a well-known doctor at Mercy Hospital. Tucked behind his badge was a clearance card with Department of Homeland Security markings. Linda's eyebrows rose as she read more carefully. She quietly waved over a colleague from Federal Investigations who had just arrived on the scene for support, speaking in hushed tones. Without wasting a second, Linda pulled up the department network and started checking the file. When she realized exactly who Malcolm was, her breath caught. He was not just some local doctor. He was a trusted advisor for a major public emergency task force with regular clearance to sensitive government meetings. The implications crashed over her like a wave. She turned to scan the scene, realizing the eyes of the city, and maybe even Washington, would be watching what happened here tonight. News of Malcolm's identity buzzed through the officers and responders, passing in tense whispers. Everyone around seemed to stand a little straighter, a chill running up their spines as they considered the fallout. The facts were far bigger than they first appeared, too public and too serious for any half-truth to last long. Brian O'Reilly, listening in, felt his stomach drop as the realization dawned. He could already picture the headlines, and worse, the long questioning that would follow. The situation had slipped beyond his control, closing in around him with a sense of doom that could not be undone. Within an hour, the news had spread far past the city blocks of Hyde Park. What started as a regular emergency call-out became something far more urgent as the identity of Dr. Malcolm Porter reached the dispatch offices. Up at the headquarters of the Chicago Police Department, phone lines and email inboxes started pinging non-stop. It was not just local supervisors checking in anymore. Now, there were calls from Washington, state officials, and even senior staff at the Department of Homeland Security. No one wanted to wait for a report. Everyone demanded answers. Linda Gonzalez, already standing near the crime scene tape, felt the shift. The usual reassurance she gave her people was drowned out by the sheer speed and force of the outside pressure. Before they could even finish, taking statements, teams of federal agents in windbreakers started setting up along the sidewalk, their dark blue jackets marked with bold yellow letters. It all felt unreal, but there was no time for disbelief. Back at Mercy Hospital, a harsh, white light cut through the waiting area where Malcolm was being rushed into surgery. Nurses and doctors moved quickly, whispering to each other when they realized who he was. The operating room filled with a tense urgency that went beyond regular trauma care. In the hallways, uniformed officers stood awkwardly, trying to shield Malcolm's family from the buzzing reporters already gathering outside. Even in the frigid bustle of the hospital, a sense of something bigger kept growing. On the city's news channels, breaking banners rolled across the screen. Renowned Homeland Security advisor, shot by Chicago police officer. The story exploded on social media, each new detail spreading anger and disbelief among people across the country. Community leaders spoke up, demanding transparency and justice, while politicians rushed to make statements. There was no space for quiet cover-ups now. The entire case, and everyone even remotely involved, was suddenly center stage. As these events spun far beyond anyone's control, the city's police officers, detectives, and administrators felt pressure like never before. Every routine was interrupted by demands for updates, from the governor's office, from civil rights watchdogs, from Malcolm's own colleagues in Washington. The faces of junior officers were pale, and even the most seasoned detectives fumbled with the weight of so much attention. Meanwhile, in a cold recovery room, Malcolm fought for his life, for his family and for those who'd worked alongside him. Hope flickered between the machines and monitors. Nobody could know how it would end, but one thing was certain. The story now belonged to the nation. In the glare of the hospital's trauma wing, hours blended together for Malcolm's loved ones and the medical team. The surgeons worked with a focus born from years of training, their voices low and careful, but there was an unspoken worry circling the room. The wounds Malcolm suffered were simply too severe. Even the best specialists at Mercy Hospital could not reverse the damage, despite every attempt and every tool at their disposal. IV bags hung empty beside trays of blood-stained gauze, and tired hands pressed against stubborn bleeding that would not stop. Outside the operating room, Malcolm's family sat pressed together on those stiff waiting room chairs, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and a growing number of officials there to support, but mostly to witness. Each time a doctor stepped out with an update, hope would flicker, then fade again into a silence loaded with dread. People checked their phones for news, willing any message to say that things were improving, but every minute felt heavier than the last. Finally, as dawn crept in through the high hospital windows, the head surgeon walked into the waiting area. His face told the story before he even spoke. In a quiet, steady voice, he shared the worst. Their efforts had not been enough, and Malcolm was gone. The loss landed in the room like a punch, and all at once the group felt both completely exposed and very far away from the rest of the world. A few people cried openly, while others just sank in place, unable to string their emotions into words. The news of Malcolm's death spread quickly, first through text messages and quiet phone calls, then in an uncontainable wave as it reached the desks of the Department of Homeland Security and the national news cycle. His colleagues, who knew him not just as a busy advisor, but as a thoughtful presence in high-pressure meetings, were devastated. For those who had counted on his calm in moments of crisis, whether in city hospitals or federal planning sessions, the loss felt almost surreal. Grief gave way to anger. People talked openly about how wrong it was, how Malcolm's life ended not because of some unavoidable danger, but because of hate and panic. The story, already front-page news, now became a symbol for everything that needed to change, and no statement from city officials could soften the outrage pulsing through Malcolm's circle and well beyond. At the headquarters of the Department of Homeland Security in Washington, the mood grew heavy as word of Malcolm Porter's death reached every office. In a matter of hours, senior staff received alerts, meetings were cleared, and a string of emergency gatherings took shape. There was no typical start to this day. People abandoned their regular routines for small circles gathered around phones and monitors, email inboxes filled with condolences and calls for action. The walls that usually separated ranks blurred as grief mixed into frustration and something like betrayal. Victoria Murphy, who had worked at the department for over 30 years and was now a respected director, paced the hall outside the executive suite. She had been one of Malcolm's mentors, someone who had watched him move up through the ranks, always calm in a crisis and committed to the people he served. Now, as she watched a hastily drafted press statement get passed between trembling hands, she could not shake a feeling that she had never experienced before. Instead of her usual measured response, Victoria felt a raw anger, one that came not just from losing a colleague, but from seeing yet another act of senseless violence hit so close to home. The reaction inside the department was not about optics or damage control. It was real, and it came from deep inside. In one meeting after another, leaders spoke candidly of their sorrow and their impatience. For too long, these stories had ended with promises of change and no real action. This time, nobody was willing to accept another shallow apology. Victoria stood before a crowded conference room and said what most had been thinking. Justice for Malcolm is not optional. It is something this department will not rest until it achieves. We demand accountability, and if we do not see it publicly, we will demand it ourselves. Her words sparked more than quiet agreement. By mid-morning, key contacts in the Justice Department, city officials in Chicago, and even members of Congress started receiving calls, emails, and direct visits from Homeland Security staff. Victoria and her team made clear there would be no backing down or hiding from what happened. Pressure began to build, not in a frenzy, but in a steady, undeniable way. Malcolm's name was spoken everywhere, always in the same tone, respectful, determined, and unwilling to let things slide. This time, everyone knew the truth was going to see daylight, no matter who tried to stand in the way. In the days that followed, a quiet intensity settled over Washington and spread across the country. At the Department of Homeland Security, Victoria Murphy and her colleagues doubled down on their efforts, making sure their message reached well beyond the building's walls. Phones rang day and night, not just in offices overlooking the Capitol, but in city halls and governors' mansions all over America. Letters bearing the department's seal landed on the desks of senators and judges alike. It was not a campaign. They called it a matter of principle, and everyone who answered those calls could sense the difference. It was clear they wanted more than sympathy. Governors received calls reminding them that Malcolm Porter had served the whole nation, not just Chicago, and his killing deserved open justice. Mayors, senators, and even federal judges got the same message. There would be no patience for delays, and any hint of a cover-up or backdoor deal would be met with swift, public response from people who had real influence over public safety. Congressional offices found their inboxes stuffed with letters, some formal and some written by hand, all echoing the same crisp warning. The department had supporters willing to speak out in the media, and news hosts began to ask hard questions in interviews that reached millions. Meanwhile, the city of Chicago found itself caught in a blinding spotlight. Every reporter in the country wanted new details, and community leaders were now sharing the same stage as state and national power players. Protesters gathered in front of City Hall, carrying posters with Malcolm's name and chanting for justice. Television crews showed up early in the mornings and stayed until late at night. Stories emerged about Malcolm's life, about the work he had done with young people, the plans he had made to build safer communities. The city's police department, already under strain, faced more scrutiny with every passing hour. For police Chief Harold Bennett, the attention was overwhelming. He had spent decades working his way up through the ranks, teaching new recruits to work with honor and holding the line when mistakes were made. Now he felt the pressure from every angle, from city officials worried about riots, from officers frightened for their futures, and from the highest offices in Washington. Harold realized he had to make a painful choice: stand by Officer Brian O'Reilly no matter what, or allow a full investigation, even if it meant losing people he knew. It was a test of loyalty and leadership, and every eye in the country was watching to see how he would answer. As the city settled into an uneasy routine of protests and media vans parked on every available curb, the investigation into Malcolm Porter's death kicked into high gear. The federal and city task forces, once distant from each other, found themselves side by side, poring over every shred of evidence. Every move was watched by the press, by the Department of Homeland Security, and by neighborhood groups who wanted real answers, not just promises. With phones at his ear and flashes from camera crews lighting the night, Chief Harold Bennett leaned heavily on the process, keenly aware there would be no hiding mistakes this time. The facts spoke for themselves as the investigation unfolded. Survey footage from nearby stores and doorbell cameras gave a different story from Officer Brian O'Reilly's first account. Audio picked up by witnesses contradicted the official version filed in those first confused hours. Experts went over body cam footage, cell phone records, and even social media messages. It became obvious that what O'Reilly had tried to pass off as self-defense was really a case laced with discrimination and a pattern of questionable conduct. Rumors about O'Reilly's history, once whispered at roll call, now had the weight of internal affairs memos and documented complaints to back them up. None of this could stay hidden. The city's prosecutor, James Williams, watched the case gain momentum. Known for being ambitious but not reckless, James saw more than just headlines in this tragedy. Facing pressure from powerful agencies in D.C. and knowing that any sign of hesitation could end his own career, he made a rare commitment in front of the cameras. He promised the community and the whole country that this would not be another case swept out of sight. He said flat out that justice would be done, no matter where the facts led. After a week of tension and 24-hour news cycles, James Williams made the official announcement folks were waiting for. Officer O'Reilly was indicted for first-degree murder, and prosecutors would seek the maximum penalty allowed by Illinois law. The charges were detailed and direct, pulling from evidence and statements that left no doubt about the nature of the crime. For many, it was the first real sign that Malcolm's case would not get lost in bureaucratic fog or political games. For the city and for his family, it was the beginning of something that looked, at least on paper, like accountability. News of the indictment spread like wildfire, and within a day, it seemed the nation was tuned in to every new piece of information about Malcolm Porter's case. Television anchors broadcasted live outside the courthouse, and social media buzzed with personal stories, raw opinions, and calls for further justice. Even top government officials and military leaders made statements, echoing the urgent need for trust and transparency in public institutions. Civil rights groups organized rallies, not only in Chicago, but in other major cities as well, united by a sense that this case now stood for everyone tired of seeing similar headlines. Amid this wave of attention, Malcolm's widow, Angela Porter, stepped into the public eye. Though she had always avoided spotlights before, she spoke in a way that brought people together. Instead of letting her pain turn into bitterness, she focused on the need for change. Friends and strangers alike were moved by Angela's words. She did not ask for revenge, but pleaded for accountability and better laws to protect people like her late husband. She argued that Malcolm's life should mean something bigger than the details of that awful night, and her calm strength gave voice to thousands who had lost loved ones under similar circumstances. The day of Malcolm's funeral arrived with gray skies and heavy hearts. Dignitaries from Washington and Springfield sat quietly beside his dearest friends, colleagues, and neighbors in a crowded chapel. Police chiefs and government officials mingled with teachers, small business owners, and the students Malcolm had mentored over the years. News cameras waited respectfully outside, broadcasting scenes of unity and mourning to viewers across the country. Inside, the atmosphere was full of both deep sadness and something that felt a little like hope, as if the gathering itself pointed toward possible change. Angela stood before the crowd, her hands steady even as her voice trembled. She spoke, not of anger, but of Malcolm's kindness and his belief in building better communities. She urged those present and those watching from afar to carry forward the search for justice, not just for one family, but for everyone needing protection and respect. Something about her simple, honest appeal connected powerfully with people from all walks of life. In homes and offices across America, viewers wiped away tears and talked about how this tragedy could, finally, mark a real turning point. Her message became the rallying cry, and Malcolm's legacy stretched out far beyond Chicago that day. The opening day of Officer Brian O'Reilly's trial marked more than a spot on the calendar. It felt like the whole country pressed pause to watch what would happen in that Chicago courtroom. Weeks of tension and anticipation all funneled into this event. TV trucks lined the streets around the courthouse, antennae stretching skyward. Police in crisp uniforms stood near everyday folks who traveled in from across Illinois, drawn by a sense that this moment could shape the nation's future. Soldiers on leave from the base in Joliet mingled with college students and faith leaders, while rows of journalists kept up a steady, nervous chatter. Everyone felt the weight of what was about to unfold. Inside, Judge Randall Thomas ran a tight, even-handed bench, determined to keep the trial fair and focused. The room filled early each morning, the low hum of whispered conversations blending with the clatter of reporters' laptops. Angela Porter sat surrounded by friends, her poise an anchor for those closest to Malcolm's memory. The public defender looked tired and edgy, but the prosecution was clearly ready to go. From the start, prosecutor James Williams laid out a narrative that left little room for doubt. He described how Officer O'Reilly had confronted Malcolm on his walk home, a routine moment spiraling into disaster, not because of confusion or danger, but because of prejudice. Williams pointed to security footage, witness statements, and the sharp audio of racial slurs caught by nearby microphones. He showed the jury text messages, old complaints, and even a file of disciplinary warnings that cast a long shadow over O'Reilly's history. Witness after witness took the stand. Some, especially Malcolm's friends, struggled to get through, their statements, their voices trembling as they recounted the night he died. Even police officers, many of whom had worked beside O'Reilly for years, could not avoid the truth forever. Some looked away when the prosecution played recordings. Others admitted under oath that they had worried about his behavior, but never thought it would end in tragedy. By the time Williams finished laying out his case, the gravity in the courtroom was unmistakable. There was no shouting, only a kind of quiet shock as the jury absorbed the story in all its painful detail. Each day, the room emptied as if heavier than before, people carrying the burden of what they had just witnessed out into the uncertain light of the city streets. As the trial stretched into its second week, everyone sensed a turning point approaching. On a Thursday morning, the courtroom was unusually quiet, with every seat filled and even the bailiff looking a bit somber. Angela Porter was called to the witness stand. She walked slowly, hands folded, eyes fixed ahead. From the gallery, you could see how everyone, jurors, lawyers, reporters, sat up a little straighter, tuned in for what would come next. Angela's voice was clear, but soft. She spoke about her life with Malcolm, painting a picture of a man who loved Sunday barbecues, cracked jokes at the breakfast table, and always had time to help their neighbors. She did not raise her voice or dramatize the story. Instead, she shared moments. Malcolm teaching their son to ride a bike in Lincoln Park, the way he sent handwritten notes to friends when they were going through a hard time, quiet evenings. Spent walking along Lake Michigan just talking about the future. She did not shy away from her pain either. She talked about what it was like to wake up each morning, reaching for someone who would never come home again. There were tears in the room, jurors wiping their eyes, reporters putting down their pens for a minute. Angela did not ask the jury for vengeance. She said Malcolm would have wanted justice, not anger, and she asked that his memory be honored by choosing truth over fear. When Angela finished, the silence held for a while. Even Judge Thomas let the moment settle before resuming. Her words seemed to shift something in the room. Malcolm Porter was no longer just a name on charging papers. He was a father, husband, and friend. That feeling stayed with everyone as the defense tried to make their case. They argued that Officer O'Reilly had acted out of fear and confusion, thrown by the stress of the job and worried for his own safety. But the evidence, the recordings, the history, and all the testimony outweighed those claims. Even some of O'Reilly's former colleagues said they had never seen Malcolm act with aggression and saw no threat that night. As closing statements neared, people inside and outside the courthouse sensed the end was near. The jury, stone-faced and silent, carried the burden of what they had heard, knowing that the whole country waited for their choice. The closing arguments wrapped up, and soon after, the jury retreated behind closed doors, leaving the rest of the city to wait on edge. For days, the courthouse felt like it was holding its breath. Crowds gathered outside each morning, a blend of hopeful and anxious faces, some clutching homemade signs, while others simply stood in silence, eyes fixed on the building's heavy doors. News vans broadcast the same persistent question: what would the jury decide? Inside, tension never left the air. Angela Porter spent hours in a quiet room, just off the courtroom, sometimes joined by family, sometimes alone. Judge Thomas kept to his chambers, reviewing notes and preparing for any outcome. The jury, a carefully chosen mix from neighborhoods across Chicago, took their task seriously. They listened to evidence again, read through transcripts, and argued late into the evenings. It was not just another court case. Every juror seemed to understand this verdict would echo far beyond those four walls. On a gray Thursday afternoon, the jury returned. The room grew still as the forewoman stood to read the verdict. "Guilty," she said, "of murder in the first degree, aggravated by racial hatred." At those words, emotions burst through every corner of the chamber. People wept openly, families with relief, lawyers with exhaustion and pride, police officers with complicated expressions. Many in the public gallery sat in shock, trying to process what it all meant. It was a moment that pushed Chicago into the national conversation about race, power, and accountability, and made it clear that the country's patience for these tragedies had real limits. The next step was sentencing, and the pressure did not let up. Prosecutors pressed for the harshest penalty allowed by the state, arguing that anything less would send the wrong message. They spoke of lost potential and the pain it caused the community, pushing for either life in prison or, if the law permitted, the death sentence. On the other side, O'Reilly's lawyers pleaded for mercy, pointing to his years of service and claiming that even a person who did wrong could change. Judge Thomas faced what no one would call an easy decision. The entire court seemed to hold its breath once again as he weighed arguments, looked at O'Reilly, and considered the weight of history. No one could escape the gravity of the moment. Not Angela, not the city, not a jury changed forever by what they had seen. Finally, the day everyone had been waiting for arrived. The courthouse buzzed with nervous energy as Judge Thomas entered, his presence commanding instant silence. He took his seat and paused, as if letting the moment settle, on the shoulders of everyone in the room. The whole country, and even people abroad, were watching this decision. Looking directly at Officer O'Reilly, the judge spoke in a clear, steady voice. He called Malcolm Porter's killing a crime of the highest moral and institutional gravity, a violation not only of law, but of the social trust that bound people together. This was not just one man's loss, Thomas said, but a wound carried by the whole community, a symbol of harm inflicted by prejudice cloaked in authority. He explained that after weighing all evidence, testimony, and the aggravating factors, Only one penalty could match the seriousness of the crime. The judge pronounced the sentence, death. The courtroom fell into total stillness. For a moment, it felt like no one even breathed. Angela squeezed her brother's hand as silent tears ran down her face. Some in the room felt relief, others discomfort, and many simply sat, heavy with the enormity of the judge's words. The sentence was rare in Illinois, and the country had not seen many like it in recent decades. Outside, reporters scrambled to relay the news, their voices crackling over radios and television screens from New York to Los Angeles and even across the Atlantic. The reaction was swift and intense. In some neighborhoods, people gathered on sidewalks, talking in hushed voices, sharing everything from satisfaction to outright dismay. On social media and news shows, experts hotly debated whether this was justice achieved or another painful chapter in a long struggle. Activists held up the decision as a demand to confront racism and unchecked power. Others argued it highlighted deeper questions about the death penalty itself. Around the world, international groups weighed in, each with their own perspectives. Angela Porter spoke to a group of reporters outside the courthouse, her voice calm but edged with pain. She said the decision would never bring Malcolm back, that her family's loss stayed as deep as ever, but she also said she hoped this story would mean something, that maybe, amidst the controversy, it would move more people to fight for fairness, accountability, and a future where tragedies like this would finally end. The city was quiet that night, carrying the weight of what had happened and what maybe could change tomorrow.